Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video, we're going to be exploring popular movements during the Warlord period. And by that, I mean two key knowledge points, the New Culture movement and the May 4th movement. So these are significant movements that took place in response to the desire for change in China, and also in response to the control of warlords. So the key knowledge points that we'll be covering in this session or in this video rather, are challenges to the early Republican era, and particularly the New Culture and the May 4th movements. Now, they are, in the study design, lumped together. They're just as it's written here, the New Culture and the May 4th movements. And that's because they're sort of synonymous. So when people talk about the May 4th movement, they're also often talking about the changes made during the New Culture movement. So if you are presented with a question, let's say in a SAC or in an exam, that refers to the May 4th movement, yes, you can talk about what happened on May 4th, which I'll get to very shortly, but you can also talk about the changes that took place during the New Culture movement. So anyway, that's a longer than usual preamble, but let's get right into it. So let's start with the New Culture movement and overview. So partly due to the failure of the 1911 revolution, China's young people embarked on a re-evaluation of China's place in the world. This became known as the New Culture movement. Again, I've mentioned in a previous video, but I'll mention it again. Students and young people were a key revolutionary group during the Chinese Revolution. And so it's significant that it was China's young people, China's students, that embarked on this reevaluation of China's place in the world. There were some intellectuals, some young intellectuals that were involved as well, but yeah, the New Culture movement and the May 4th movement are spearheaded by students. So the New Culture movement, headed by young intellectuals and students, and adopted by students, sought to create a new cultural identity for China by questioning Confucian traditions, which had been around for thousands of years, finding new writing styles, and examining China's future. New ideas and ways of thinking were explored, including nationalism, feminism, liberalism, democracy, anarchism, socialism, and Marxism-Leninism, following in the footpath of what was happening in Russia at the time. Historian Rana Mitter describes the New Culture movement period as intellectually and socially one of the most promising and exciting times in Chinese history. So this was a time of idea generation, really. It was through writing, through speeches, through newspapers that were set up. This was a time of enormous ingenuity and testing out new ideas of how what China's future would look like. So the New Culture movement, the impacts and significance of the movement. So anti-imperialist and anti-warlord protests erupted in the major cities as a result of the New Culture movement. Chinese nationalism increased. Students and the urban youth became increasingly radicalized and revolutionary. Now, that's the same. We can say the same about the May 4th movement. It led to radicalization of the youth. There were major intellectual, cultural, and literary innovations. And many Chinese revolutionary figures, including Mao Zedong, who, as we know, was the first chairman of the People's Republic of China. They were all influenced by or directly involved in the New Culture movement or the May 4th movement. So that's sort of an overview of the New Culture movement. I'd encourage you to look at your textbook to find out a little bit more about it in greater detail. But let's talk about the May 4th movement. So in early May 1919, students in Beijing were preparing for Day of Shame protests, commemorating the signing of the modified version of Japan's 21 Demands by Yuan Shikai 4 years prior. So remember that signing of the 21 demands happened on the 7th of May, 1915. And as I said in that video, last video, that then turned into a yearly tradition of holding Day of Shame protests. These students received news about the peace treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and had hoped that German concessions in Shandong province would be returned to China. Little did they know, however, that the national government in Beijing had made a secret agreement in 1918 to give German concessions to Japan. This is obviously the Warlord decade. Yuan Shikai had died in 1916, but there was still an internationally recognized national government in Beijing who really had no authority or power, but they did have the power to make the secret agreement in 1918. So, finding out that these German concessions in Shandong province were being given to Japan, yet another example of foreign powers having control over Chinese territory, the Day of Shame protests were brought forward 3 days to the 4th of May, 1919. Students took to the streets with over 3,000 students rallying in Tiananmen Square. After many students were arrested, protests in support of the students and their cause broke out in cities across China. Workers went on strike and Japanese goods were boycotted. Like I said, the May 4th movement is tied to the new culture movement, and they're sort of synonymous. You can talk about May 4th while meaning the new culture movement, but the May 4th movement is really about this one day in May 1919. So the May 4th movement created a sense of urgency in the resistance of foreign imperialism and against warlord corruption. And many members of the movement turned to Marxism. So when we start looking at and finding out more about the CCP, which we're going to firstly start finding out about it in just a moment, many of the members of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, came from the May 4th movement and the New Culture movement when all these ideas were being tested out. So that's why it's a significant movement, is because many of the revolutionaries of the Chinese Revolution started off as students protesting during the May 4th movement and exploring new ideas during the New Culture movement. So speaking of the CCP, let's talk briefly about the founding of the CCP. Young intellectuals became disillusioned with the liberal politics of the West and started to look to Soviet Russia for inspiration. Note that this is in 1919, so this is only 2 years or a year and a half, really, after the establishment of Sovnarkom in Russia, and this is during the Russian Civil War when the Reds were fighting for the revolution against the Whites and the Green armies. The Russian and by the way, I should note as well, you'll remember from our study of Russia that it was really the Polish-Soviet War that sort of put an end to Russian dreams of an international revolution. But that wasn't until 1920, 1921. And so by March 1919, they were still very keen on spreading communism throughout the world. And so in trying to encourage revolution abroad, the Russian communists founded the Comintern, the Communist Internationale, in March 1919. In April 1919, a Comintern agent came to China and met with Li Dazhao, a significant figure in the New Culture movement, who had already formed a Marxist study society at Beijing University. On 3rd of June, 1921, so I did say that the idea of an international revolution had sort of been stamped out with the Soviet-Polish War, but we should remember that, in China, there had been growing a growing movement for communism, and so the Comintern did still send agents to China. So 3rd of June 1921, a more senior Comintern agent known as Maring arrived in China. And on the 23rd of July 1921, he organized the secret First National Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Mao Zedong attended as the delegate from Hunan province, and this Congress marked the official birth of the CCP. However, the Chinese Communist Party was initially very small, with only 57 members. And at this First National Party Congress, there were 13 delegates representing those 57 total members. We will find out soon how vastly or how greatly the CCP membership grew. But at this point, in mid-1921, at the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, they were less than 100 members, only 57. So in this video, we've had a look at the at two popular movements, the New Culture movement and the May 4th movement. Both are sort of synonymous with the other, and both grew or developed a revolutionary consciousness among the youth of China. I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.